Welcome to the Employment Masterclass. I'm Narelle from HR for Health Leaders, and for the next 90 minutes, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can hire your staff members for your allied health clinic. So, you might be wondering who I am if you haven't already come across me. So, I've been working in HR for about 13, 14 years now, and I currently work a part-time job in corporate HR and have been running HR for Health Leaders part-time for about 4 years as well. So what makes me a little bit different is I'm not just a HR specialist. I actually co-owned a remedial massage clinic here in Perth, where I'm based, for about 4 years. So I understand how HR applies specifically to you and your type of business. And why are you here today, I guess? So most of my clients that I work with tend to be fairly fully booked and they want to see more clients and scale their income, have a bigger impact by seeing more clients. They want to balance paying their staff fairly, but also having a profitable business at the same time. They often aren't sure how to work out which pay rates apply or how to navigate through the award. And as part of that, when penalties and various overtime rates that are required to be paid. Other things that we come across quite regularly is therapists who are used to having a per treatment, i.e. they used to be subcontractors, and they view that rate to be higher than the hourly rate that you're offering, even when sometimes in the long run it isn't. You also really need to understand how you can structure your shifts efficiently so that you can make the most use of your treatment rooms and also your appointment availability and best utilize your staff. Often people will ask me if they can get their therapist to do other work when they're not treating clients. So let's say they have a cancellation, whether they can do some other work during that time since you're still paying them wages. And generally people just need some advice and guidance on how to navigate the award because it's pretty long and not always easy to understand, and not everything applies to private businesses, private allied health clinics. So we'll help you navigate that today. I just want to start also with saying that at the end of this, you'll have access to some documents of mine. One of those is a pay rate guide, which is basically an overview and summary of all the pay rates that apply, when the penalties apply, and various worksheets and information documents as well. So you can take notes during this, but just be aware that you don't need to take notes about everything because there will be some workbooks provided afterwards. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the legislation and award coverage, different pay rates, how to structure your shifts, ideas about how you can offer additional remuneration, which could be in the form of bonuses or higher hourly rates, whether you're across your tax, superannuation and workers' comp and how that works, your payroll software and how you report to the ATO, how you sell employment to a subcontractor, for want of a better word, and when and how you would transition your casual therapists or administration staff through to a permanent position. So if you're still asking the question about whether you can have subcontractors, you might need to pause this and go back and have a look at some of my other resources. I've got a free ebook download on subcontracting, plenty of resources out there from lawyers as well. So just as a brief summary on why we talk about employment rather than contracting. So in 2009, the Fair Work Act came into effect, which is our current industrial relations system. And in that, there was this notion of sham contracting. This is also something that exists within taxation legislation that the ATO cares about as well. Two separate but correlated acts, basically. And some of the key items that make someone more likely to be an employee than a contractor are things like the amount of control you have over how they perform their work, whether they have any of their own financial responsibility and risk, whether you supply the tools and equipment, whether they can delegate or subcontract the work to other people, or whether you require them to do the work, whether you set their hours, whether they have an expectation of continuing work. And other factors that we often consider are things like, are they wearing a uniform and do they present as part of your business? Do you own the clients and you give them, offer them to the staff member, but you otherwise present that therapist to be part of your business, not running their separate business? So that's generally when we talk about employees. And in my experience, most clinic owners want a level of control over their therapists that indicate they would be employees. They're not renting a room to someone that can run their own business. They want someone to work for them. So if you want to rent a room to someone, that's also an option. It tends to work best when you have alternative professions working with you. So for example, when we were running a clinic, we at our peak had probably 5 therapists and 1 part-time administrator, and we also rented a room to a life coach on a casual basis. She ran a completely separate business and we had no interference in how she did that. She literally just paid a fee to rent the room from us. So I won't go too much detail into that, but if you need to go revisit some of those questions first. But basically, if you're ready, if you know you want employees in your business, then this is the webinar for you. So we'll talk a bit about coverage of legislation and awards. So the Fair Work Act also has inside of it 11 national employment standards. It's part of the Act and they're outlined here. So basically they're things like maximum weekly hours before overtime applies, people being able to request flexible work arrangements if they are carers, or whether that's of young children or of elderly parents, for example. And there's a few other conditions when people can request flexible work arrangements formally. A lot of people in our industry generally work flexibly anyway, so you probably already do this informally, and that's perfectly fine. Casual conversion is actually a right under the Act now, so that means that if someone's been employed with you for 12 months, they have a right to request permanent employment. We'll talk more about that later. There's other provisions like parental leave and related entitlements, annual leave, personal, carers, compassionate, family and domestic violence leave, community service, which is things like jury duty and defence force, long service leave, public holidays, how much notice on termination you need to give someone, and actually having access to what they call the Fair Work Information Statement and the Casual Statement, which are just pieces of advice documents that you have to give each employee when you hire someone new. And it basically outlines these 10 entitlements from the Fair Work Commission. Now, I'll just make a note that everyone in Australia in private business is covered by the Fair Work Act, unless, because WA like to do things a little bit differently, and if you're from WA, you will have a giggle, unless you're a sole trader, partnership, or an unincorporated trust in WA. Now, if you're a company in WA, you're still covered by Fair Work. If you're one of the others, you are covered by the Industrial Relations Act of WA, and you are listening to the wrong information. So if you're one of those people, please do not listen to this unless you're intending on becoming a company and transitioning to Fair Work. Please get in touch with me and I will talk to you specifically about how the WA system works. All right, so that said, let's get moving. So we've got the Health Professionals and Support Services Award, which covers all allied health type practices. So this is people like remedial massage therapists and myos. We're also talking about physios, chiros, osteos, naturopaths, dietitians, and all of your reception and administrative staff that support these businesses. Now, there is always a little bit of a question about unqualified therapists. Most of my clients only hire diploma qualified therapists, so it's fairly easily to slot them straight into the Health Professionals Award. But I do sometimes have clients who'll hire people with Cert 4s, or occasionally they might be close to finishing their diploma and so they're still studying, but they might come in and do a few hours while they're finishing off their study. Now, generally, we would say that these are also covered by the Health Professionals Award under a support services category rather than the health professionals. And this is based on the fact that when the Fair Work Commission has had complaints from some people in the past about from employees about being underpaid by their employer, they have stated that they consider them to be support services workers, even though because they're unqualified, they don't meet the health professionals, but they still consider them under this award. So when are people not covered? Like I mentioned, if you're WA system employees, some of the nuances are around this. So, occasionally I'll have clients who own day spas, for example, and if you have a remedial therapist hired at a day spa, they're normally covered by the Health Professionals Award. However, on the flip side, if you engage, for example, a beauty therapist at your remedial clinic, and I've come across a few people who combine their space to run both businesses, the beauty therapist continues to be covered by the beauty award. Likewise, if you're running a clinic, whether that's remedial or physiotherapy or osteopathy or a multidisciplinary clinic, and you employ Pilates or yoga instructors, they tend to then be covered by the fitness industry award. Some of the nuances are if you have someone who is both a remedial therapist or perhaps a physio or myo or osteo who also offers Pilates classes, because I know that's often goes hand in hand, then they may be covered by both. So I'd suggest that you give me a call to have a chat if that's something that occurs in your business. We can talk through how that works. Some other options of when people are not covered could be things like if you're running a separate training or coaching business. So let's say you're running a training business where you offer training to massage therapists or even to the public about, for example, couples massage, and you have a completely separate business that runs that, and you hire an administrative staff, for example, to facilitate that business, and they're not related to your clinic, they are often then not covered by this award because you might own a clinic, but you might own a separate business and they're employed by the separate business, for ease of explaining that. Or perhaps this is not common in clinics, but potentially if you're running a training business, for example, if you've got degree qualified type staff like marketing staff, they would not be employed by your clinic normally. But if you're talking about any sort of receptionist, administrator, practice managers working in-house inside your clinic, they are normally covered by the Health Professionals Award. So yeah, if you're not sure, like I mentioned with Pilates, just let me know and I can double check that you're listening to the right information, because this masterclass is very specific to the application of the Health Professionals Award. So in the award, how do we understand pay rates? So there are different levels. There are two groups. There are the health professionals, which are your therapists, and then support services, which is admin staff, and there are other categorizations in there. Sometimes it's easy to forget that the award actually covers, for example, physios in hospitals. So there are some support services roles that are related to that type of environment. So there is a lot of things in there that aren't specific to private practices, but do have relevance to other professions that are covered by this. So when we're talking about therapists, you have several levels. Level 1 and 2 is determined by experience, and the starting pay point depends on qualification. So what I mean by that is all graduates start in level 1, and whether there are 6 pay points in level 1, and they start at the pay point relevant to their qualification. So a diploma qualified massage therapist starts at pay point 1, whereas a 3-year degree qualified employee starts at pay point 2, a 4-year degree, pay point 3, and so on. Like I said, this is all in my pay rate guide, so don't worry about jotting down notes too madly. You can easily refer back to that. Now, they also progress annually through the pay points. So if they are full-time, if they're part-time or casual, it's every 1,824 hours, which is essentially the equivalent of how many hours a person would work in 1 year minus taking their leave, if that's an easy way to remember it. So what this means is that if you've got hiring someone casual who's been employed for 2 years, roughly working 20 hours a week somewhere else, they will now have enough experience to have 1 year full-time experience, which means they move up to pay point 2. Now, once someone progresses into once someone progresses into level 2, so they've moved through all 6 pay points in level 1, they don't necessarily increase in pay points within level 2 unless they attain new skills and experience during their employment with you. So often people will sit at a level 2 pay point 1 because by that stage in their career, they tend to be fairly stable. And normally you will not have a therapist who's level 3 or higher, because level 3 starts talking about their responsibility in your business rather than their experience. So that would be more, I don't see it often in private practice, but let's say you have 5 different clinics, or maybe you have a very large clinic and you have, this would happen more with physiotherapists, for example, than you would ever see with massage therapists. You might have an extremely senior therapist who is mentoring, supervising, managing more junior staff. Could apply then, but very unlikely to apply in most settings. Now, support services, this is where your admins sit, and the level is largely determined by their responsibility. There is some reference to qualification and experience, but not so much. Normal admin, sort of experienced general level administrators, reception, experienced reception and administrators who exercise a reasonable amount of control over the way they do their work, and they know what they're doing. They don't need lots of direction. They're normally level 3s and 4s. If you've got a really junior person who you're still training and mentoring, they could be a level 1 or 2. That's sort of how that works. And like I mentioned before, your unqualified therapists, like whether it could be a Cert 4 because diploma is the minimum level for a health professional, or they could be someone who's, like I mentioned, still studying and almost completed, and maybe they're going to come on board for a couple of months as a offering deep tissue massages, not yet remedial or relaxation services. Then they normally come in as support services level 2 or 3. Penalty rates and overtime. So this comes partly down to the ordinary hours of your clinic, which is something dictated by the award. I don't mean your ordinary opening hours. So if you're a physiotherapy, chiropractic or osteopathic practice, the ordinary hours of operation are 9:30 a.m. till 9 p.m. Monday to Friday. If you're anything other than what is dictated in that specific clause in the award that aren't listed, like remedial clinics, then ordinary hours are 6 a.m. till 6 p.m. Now, if you have a multidisciplinary clinic, often you will fit into the first basket. If you're only offering remedial services, you will be in the second basket. It's a really unfortunate issue in the award that we have, because it's very specific about which types of practices are considered in the later trading hours. Now, we all know that everyone in massage trades later, and it's really an expectation of most clients, so it's an unusual thing. Something that we will try and have the commission change, but it's a long process of application to vary an award. It's a big formal application process. So I'll keep you guys updated if that changes in the near future, hopefully. But for now, if you're a remedial clinic, you're working until 6 p.m. as ordinary hours. Now, what that means is that if you have a shift that finishes after 6 o'clock on Monday to Friday, that shift is payable at the penalty rate. And it's a shift penalty rate, which is a 15% loading on top of the ordinary hourly rate. Shifts on weekends attract the weekend penalty rate, which is a 50% loading on top of ordinary rates. And then overtime rates, sometimes people get confused. So shift penalties, or any penalty, is ordinary hours with a penalty. It's not overtime. Overtime is separate. Overtime rates apply only after someone has worked 38 hours a week or 10 hours a shift, which is very unlikely, or if they're part-time and they've worked in excess of their agreed contracted hours without prior arrangement to change their hours. So that leads us a little bit into the different types of employment we have. So most people, when they're first hiring, will start with a casual staff member. The only stipulation with casuals is that their minimum shift length is 3 hours. And basically you can change their shifts as needed based on your operational requirements. And so basically based on your client bookings. Permanent staff members can be either part-time or full-time. Full-time simply means that they work 38 hours a week. Part-time means they work anything less than that. And they are entitled to leave like a full-time employee, but on a pro rata basis. So if they normally work 20 hours a week instead of 38, and they're taking 4 weeks leave a year, they get 4 weeks at 20 hours a week rather than 4 weeks at 38 hours. Like I mentioned earlier, there's this right to request what's called casual conversion after 12 months. So if someone has ongoing employment for a 12-month period and there's a reasonable expectation that that will continue, and there's no reason that you couldn't offer it to them, then they have a right to ask for casual conversion, and you can only refuse it on reasonable business grounds. Now, a little bit about strategies for how you can make that transition. So often I will say to people, if you have a therapist who's working 15 clients a week and you'd like them to see 20 and they're casual, they've been with you 6 months, they're very consistently booked, because the part-time rate is lower than the casual rate, because you have to count for holidays and sick leave and public holidays that you need to pay them for when they're not at work. What you can do is say, okay, you're working 15 hours at the moment. I would like you to work 20. I'm going to ask you if you want to go to part-time. Now, your hourly rate will drop slightly, but overall in the week, you're going to earn more than you were earning before because you're now working more hours. It's much more palatable for them to see still an overall increase rather than getting them to 20 clients a week and then them having nowhere to go because that's fully booked, and then they have to drop down wages. That often doesn't end well. Now, just because you have an obligation to offer them permanent employment under this casual conversion, they don't have an obligation to accept it. So just be aware of that. If they ever say, no, I'd like to stay casual, just make sure you make a note about it so that if anyone ever complains in future, you have reference where you can say, I offered, at these varying points in time, and the employee always said no. Now, there's also something new that I'm not sure if everyone's aware of, but there's this thing called paid family and domestic violence leave. Now, this is essentially the only type of leave that is paid for casuals as well as for full-time staff. And this is part of the government's, attempt to help people, predominantly women, escape family and domestic violence situations. It's unfortunate that as a society we need this, but it is something that they've brought in recently. It applies to small businesses which is anyone with less than 15 employees from August 2023. It has applied for about a good 6 months in larger organisations, but they gave small business a bit of a grace period. So hopefully you never need that, but if you do, there's some really great resources, for your staff on the Fair Work Commission website, which you can have a look, and you can always ask me if you have questions. I won't go into too much detail about that. Right, so we've talked a little about the casual conversion. Now, another note is about probationary periods and unfair dismissal. So basically, as a small business with less than 15 employees, your employees can't apply for an unfair dismissal claim if you fire them unless they've been employed for at least 12 months. If you have more than 15 employees, the minimum period of employment is 6 months. So when we talk about probations, it's normally a time where you can assess their performance and figure out whether they're a good fit for your business. Because as we know, sometimes people who are great therapists or great at anything, whichever role we're talking about, aren't always the best cultural fits. So hopefully you've hired well, but just that's what a probation is for. Now, normally the probation actually doesn't exist in the legislation. Essentially, when we say probation, we're putting the employee on notice that we're going to be watching and we might make a decision that we don't want to continue their employment. They can do the same with us if they don't think we're a good fit. But generally you would tie the probation to no more. You basically should never have a probation period that's longer than the unfair dismissal minimum employment period, because if you were to fire them, let's say you're a large business with more than 15 employees, and you make their probation 9 months, and the unfair dismissal application period is 6 months, they can apply for unfair dismissal, and you can't just say to the commission, oh, but they're in their probation. So that's the way we work that. Most people only stick to a standard 3 or 6 month probation, and sometimes they'll extend it. So if you do 3 months and you don't think you've had enough time to assess, you might do another 3 months. It's really good to talk about expectations up front. This is whether we're talking about performance or casuals and permanent part-times. So I often suggest that, if you make it clear to people that your intentions is that you would really like them to be a permanent part-time employee in 3, 6, 12 months' time, they're much more amenable to the idea, and up front that that's what they want, rather than them expecting to be paid a higher casual rate for the rest of their employment if your intention is to have ongoing part-timers. Now, the great thing about part-time and full-time is you just get more stability. You have standard notice periods that apply for you and them, and they not always, often casuals can be very committed, but they tend to have more commitment to the business long term. Right. Yeah, I think that last thing to note with part-time. So if you are offering someone part-time, you need to know that you have to guarantee their hours of work, same as full-time. So if you offer them 20 hours a week, you have to pay them for 20 hours a week, regardless of if you have work. The difference with part-time also is you technically need to stipulate their hours in their contract. So you need quite specific hours. And if they've been with you for 6 months, they're on your roster, they probably do have consistent hours. So that might look like saying, you work Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. till 4 p.m. And then you work Saturday, every second Saturday from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. That's perfectly fine. So that's the sort of level of detail we need to be across when we're looking to engage someone part-time. Quite interestingly, when you have a full-time person, you actually don't have to state what times they're going to work. You just have to offer them 38 hours a week. And then we talk about job descriptions. Just make sure that you're clear upfront about expectations as well. So if you are engaging a therapist, you might want to have things in their job description about expectations of taking notes, obviously, but also things like rebooking clients, answering the reception phone, making follow-up calls with clients. This is particularly if you don't have a receptionist. You might want them to help you write some social media posts or draft some blog posts. They might be responsible for laundry in the clinic or other things, minor cleaning things like wiping down light switches that are covered in oil, filling up oil bottles or other consumables. And the reason I say this is because sometimes when therapists are used to being subcontractors, if that's where they've come from, they sort of have this idea that because they were only paid to treat clients, that they aren't required to do anything else in the business. So if you're hiring them as an employee and you want them to be able to do other things when they're not working as a therapist because they've had a cancellation or there's just half an hour spare between the next client, you can definitely ask them to do these things. Just be clear about it up front so they don't get any surprises after they start. So that leads into selling employment to a subcontractor. So I've got some little calculations here. So I wanted to paint a bit of a picture of how you calculate wages, then how you look at revenue and how you can compare that for someone to what they would have earned if they were on a commission basis. So here I've got a little example. Now, these aren't exact award rates. I've rounded to make the numbers nice and easy to read. And like I said, you'll get a pay rate guide, so make sure you refer back to that. And just remember that these rates change every year on the 1st of July. This year, the Commission put them up 5.75%. That's in 2023. So they will increase again. In normal years, it's normally only between 1.5% to 3%. In the last couple of years, because of the high inflation that we've had, the increase has been over 5%. So just be aware of that when you're also thinking about budgeting for wage increases and price rises, etc. So here we've got weekday rate. So I'm basically guessing what someone might work, which is probably a fairly realistic guess. So let's say we have someone that we roster for 10 massages during the week with hours that finish before 6 o'clock. Most of my clients that I talk to, standard offer is 60-minute massages with a 15-minute gap in between clients. So you can adjust this. I've got this in a document that you can download afterwards. So you can type in your figures and see what it comes up with. But we'll just use this for the calculation. Now, the hourly rate's close to $35. This is for a level 1 pay point 1, so a fresh graduate. So remember, the rates are going to be higher if you're hiring someone with experience. So this would basically be 2 weekday shifts finishing before 6. Then we've got 1 weekday shift finishing after 6. So got another 5 massage shift, that's 6 hours. The shift work rate is closer to $38.50. And then the weekend rate is closer to $48. So they're working 6 hours on a Saturday. Now, in total, you can see I've worked out there, that would mean their wage would be roughly $977 for the week. Now, let's talk a bit about how much revenue you're going to make from that. Most of my clients, I find, tend to have therapists who are 80 to 90% booked. You really want to hit at least 80%. If you're hitting less, you need to do some work on things like marketing, and rebooking clients is often a big problem with new therapists. Not a problem, it's a challenge. We just need to work with them to improve their rebooking rate. and making sure that you are able to fill their books, running cancellation lists and other things to try and keep their rates booked well. So let's say they're 80% booked. They had 20 massages available based on the roster that we had on the previous screen. So there you can see if they were 80% booked, they would do 16. If they're 90% booked, they would do 18. And if they're 100% booked, they would complete 20 of those massages. For this, I've assumed that your charge rate for a 60-minute massage is $110, remembering this is going to include GST as well. So there you can see the revenue rates. So if we have a look here as a little comparison as to what they would earn as a contractor. So basically I'm looking at their wage of $977 plus 11% super, which is the super percentage that applies from the 1st of July 2023. That also goes up annually at the moment. It's going up 0.5% each year until it reaches, I believe, until it reaches 12.5%. So that will be a few more years of it increasing annually. So the total wage cost is $1,084 for the week, assuming that they work their roster as planned and you haven't sent them home early for missed clients, etc. So, and then we've got their revenue, depending on how booked they were. And then you can see their wage cost as a percentage, including super. So you can see if they're only 80% booked, it's costing you about 61%, whereas if they're 100% booked, it's only costing you 49% of their wage. Or their wage is costing 49% of the revenue, sorry. So I hope that paints a bit of a picture. Now, for comparison, most times when I talk to people, subcontractors are expecting anywhere between 50 and 65% payment. Noting as well that a lot of contractors their employers don't pay their super even though they should. So you need to make sure that you include super in the calculations when you're talking about percentages. So this is just a bit of an idea for you. Now, what about permanent employees? So I've also included a little download for you that has the same calculations, but with a permanent example. Now you've got to remember with casuals, you only pay them for when they're at work. With a permanent staff member, you pay them 52 weeks of the year, assuming that they have enough paid leave for the absences they take, because you're paying them for annual leave, you pay them for public holidays when they don't have to work, and you pay them for sick leave. Now with public holidays, you're only paying them public holidays that would ordinarily be a day of work. So if someone ordinarily works 5 hours on a Monday and it's a public holiday, you pay them 5 hours for the Monday. If they don't normally work Monday, you don't pay them anything. Now, what this means is that permanents normally only work 46 of the weeks of the year, roughly, once you account for 4 weeks for annual leave and about 2 weeks of sick leave and holiday pay thrown in there for public holidays. So when you're working out the calculations for them, you really need to think about the fact that your revenue from 46 weeks of the year of them working needs to pay for 52 weeks of the year of their wage. So just keep that in mind when you're explaining to people, they will see the lower hourly rate than a casual and might balk at that. But you want to have a bit of a look at the overall picture per year, which is what I've included in the calculations. Now, sometimes it actually does cost a few percentage cheaper to have permanent staff than it does for casuals. And even if you're casuals, if maybe your price is higher than that, or you want to offer a slightly higher rate, that's perfectly fine. You have a couple of options. So you can offer a higher hourly rate, and you can offer an higher hourly rate for some or all of the rates. So let's say that the rate for weekends is already quite high. You probably don't need to offer more than that. But perhaps you want to offer more than the $35 an hour for Monday to Friday ordinary time. Maybe you want to offer the same as the shift work rate so that it's a few dollars an hour higher for any time they work Monday to Friday. Other things you can do is offer bonuses. So some people might do a simple, I will pay you $5 per massage you complete on top of your hourly rate. That's fairly simple. Other people will do things like I've often suggested, particularly when you have people used to the percentage rates. Say someone says to you, I'm used to earning 55 or 60% as a contractor. I'm worried I'm not going to earn the same when I'm a casual. You could, at the end of each month or each quarter, each week if you wanted to, but you probably want to do it less regularly, have a look at how much revenue they earned versus how much you paid them. So let's say that the revenue was, I'll pick a big number, let's say it's a quarter, they earn $10,000 in revenue. And they are expecting to get 55% of that would be $5,500. So if you have a look at it and you go, I paid you $5,500 including super, happy days, we're sweet, everyone's happy, you got what you expected. If, let's say, they're 100% booked and they're earning you more revenue than you need to pay their wage, maybe they only cost you 45% of their wage, which can happen with permanent staff. You might then say to them, oh, I've underpaid you $500 compared to what I was prepared to pay you. Here's a bonus for $500. Now, just to be clear, that bonus does get treated as ordinary earnings, so you have to pay super on that bonus, and you still have to withhold tax for the employee. But there's a few options there. And one of the reasons you would do a bonus is because it also helps prevent the risk that you are going to end up spending more on wages than you were prepared to spend, because they're not booked enough or any other factors. So just take that into account. So when we're looking at rosters, and meal breaks as part of that, is under the award, they're entitled to a paid tea break for every 4 hours of work. Now, that tea break is essentially, remember I said this award also applies to, say, physios in a hospital setting. So I imagine that they probably see clients back to back. They're running from pillar to post. They probably have no scheduled downtime unless they schedule a 10-minute break. Now, the reality is that most of my clients have 15 minutes in between each client already scheduled. There's no need to schedule an additional 10-minute break. The purpose of the break is really so they can go to the bathroom, they can have a cup of tea, eat a snack, and be ready for the next client. So if you've got 15 minutes between clients, you're fine. If you don't, you need to think about 10 minutes every 4 hours. Now, after 5 hours, technically an employee is entitled to an unpaid meal break that is between 30 and 60 minutes, depending on what you negotiate. However, they can work up to 6 hours if you both agree without a break. Now, what that looks like is if you're a clinic running 1 hour treatments with 15 minutes between every client, it will take you 5 hours to perform 4 massages, including the 15 minutes in between. Technically, an employee could say to you, I'm working 5 or more hours, I want a 30-minute unpaid break during the day, during that shift, and you would have to do it. But realistically, what we see in practice is most therapists don't want to extend their workday an extra half an hour just to have a break for 5 hours. So they might say to you, no, I'm happy to work 5, that's fine. But if they said, no, I want it, you would have to give it to them. They can't work more than 6 hours without a break. So what that looks like is if they're seeing 5 clients, that would take 6 hours and 15 minutes. That's over the agreed rate, over the agreed time they can work without a break. So what you would normally do is schedule 2 or 3 clients in a row, a break, and then the other 2 or 3 clients, depending on how long their day is. So, and that break, like I said, can be 30 to 60 minutes, depending what you negotiate. When I was running a clinic, we had one therapist who was working full time. She would generally take a 45-minute break, but she was also working 5 days a week. She was doing some admin work as well, not just treating. So she wasn't treating for 38 hours a week. She was treating for roughly 28 to 30 hours a week and then doing about 10 hours of admin. So we made sure that she liked a slightly longer break. She didn't want an hour. Most of our therapists would only ever have half an hour because they were normally only there for a 6.5 hour shift roughly. Now, I have had the odd question about a split shift. So think about, you might be familiar with this from, say, chefs in hospitality, where they work a lunch shift, they have a break, and then they work a dinner shift. I sometimes get questions from people about this because they want a daytime shift and someone to come and work at night at peak times. It's actually not provided for in the award, so it's not technically something you can do. I will say with one exception, unless the employee wants it and you agree to it under what we call an individual flexibility arrangement. I've only seen this done a couple of times, which I would agree with these situations. So one, I'll give you an example. There's a guy who, him and his boss, so the employee and the business owner, both love to go to the gym. Now, they both actually really like going to the gym in the middle of the day because it's quiet, it's easy for them. So what they basically worked out was that they both work, say until lunchtime, then they would take, I think it was 2.5 hours in the middle of the day. They would go to the gym, go have their lunch, come back, and then do the evening shift. That suited him because of his situation. Likewise, you might have a mum, maybe she wants to come in and do school hours. She needs to do the school drop off, but she could come back at 5 o'clock when partner gets home from work, and helps take over from the kids. Again, because that's something that they want, you could do that. What you can't do is say, I want you to work a split shift and take 3 hours off during the day, because that's not to their benefit. So just keep that in mind. I mentioned this earlier, but a minimum shift for a casual is 3 hours. There's actually no notice to change shifts. So if you had a shift scheduled for a casual at 9 a.m. and all of their clients cancelled, you could technically call them at 8:50 and tell them not to come to work. Now, they're probably going to be pretty unhappy. So you really need to balance the practicality and the human part of having employees. So I'll give you an example with what we used to do with some of our therapists. We would generally run a morning and an afternoon shift in the clinic. So we would have a 9 till 2 and then a 2:30 till 7:30 shift. That was 2 sets of 5 hours, which meant 2 sets of 4 massages in a row, which is what most liked. We did do some longer shifts as well for some when they liked it and we had room availability. What that means is that you can use 2 people in one room. So for those of you who are thinking about expanding, you currently have one room, you're thinking you need another room to hire, you probably don't. If you're massaging 20 clients a week, if you shuffle your roster around slightly, you can easily fit another therapist in your room for probably another 20 massages a week. So just keep that in mind. That's a way to use your room efficiently, especially if you're paying, you're paying rent for the space. If you're renting an entire clinic and you have heaps of spare space, no issues. But if you're renting one room, thinking about renting a second room, you really want that to be efficient to have the best use of your costs and keep your overhead down. So backtracking to the changing shifts. So if you're having someone change shifts, so we would have a 9 a.m. booked for the next day. And perhaps at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, there was no client booked for 9. Their first one was at 10:15. We would send them a message and say, hey, just letting you know, there's no client booked at 9. We'll wait and see if anyone books overnight. Have a look at your schedule in the morning. If no one's booked in, just come in at 10 instead. So they had a heads up and they had enough notice that they weren't shocked at the time to know that their shift had changed. And similar at the end of the day. So if their last client wasn't booked, we would let them know at the start of the shift. If you don't have someone book in for that last client, you can go home at X time. Now that works for casuals. Obviously with part-time or permanent staff, you've guaranteed their hours. So you would just make use of that time that they're not treating staff instead. Leave entitlements. So casual staff, they do have some entitlements to leave. So if they're sick, they're entitled to take time off without being disciplined, but they don't get any payment for that. They're also entitled to access unpaid parental leave if they've worked for you for 12 months. And again, there's no payment, but it essentially means that they have an entitlement to take time off for their child, and that they are entitled to come back to their position at the end of their leave if they want to return to work. That's essentially how it functions. Now, permanent staff, you get paid annual leave, paid sick and carers leave. Now, carers leave, sick leave is pretty self-explanatory if you're unable to work due to an illness or injury. Carers leave is if someone in your family is unable to work or not even unable to work. If someone in your family is sick or injured and they require your care or support, so that could be a child, it could be a parent, a partner, whatever the situation is. And then they're also entitled to paid compassionate leave, which is if someone in their family passes away, very unfortunate, or suffers a life-threatening injury or illness. So that could look like someone's been in a car accident, they're not sure if they're going to wake up. It could be a stroke. These are terrible things to talk about, but just to give you an idea of what a life-threatening illness would be, illness or injury, which also entitles someone to access compassionate leave. So personal leave is normally 10 days per year or pro rata for part-time. Annual leave is 4 weeks per year or pro rata for part-time. Compassionate leave is 2 days per occasion. So we'll be very morbid. This is terrible, poor person this happens to, but it does happen. Someone's mother passes away. That's 2 days of compassionate leave. 6 months later, their father passes away. That's another 2 days of compassionate leave. So just to give you an example of how that functions. God hope that you never have staff that go through that, but this is the world we live in, I guess, unfortunately, sometimes. Now, when you've got permanent staff, when they're on annual leave, there's also an obligation to pay what we call annual leave loading. So that is an additional 17.5% on top of their ordinary rate of pay, which is partly to compensate for penalties. So you don't have to pay them all the penalty rates, you pay them the base rate plus their annual leave loading. Doesn't apply to other types of leave. Now, the other monetary entitlement in the award that applies to most people is uniform/laundry allowances. So if you provide your staff with a branded uniform, normally a branded shirt, you have to pay them 32 cents per shift or $1.32 per week maximum to wash their uniforms. Now, again, I think this largely comes from probably people working in hospitals that are also covered by this award, but it is what it is. You just add it in your payroll system. It's quite easy. Now, if you don't provide uniforms, you actually don't need to pay this allowance. This is another thing as well, when you're talking about expectations at work, it's also totally acceptable for you to require your employees to wear particular types of clothing, whether or not you provide them. So, and that could be as simple as, we expect you to wear black pants or grey pants, or shorts are acceptable at a certain length. You can or can't wear activewear to work, but we don't want it branded or coloured, for example. If you're there wearing their own shirts, we want them to be sleeved, or they can be polos or collared, we don't mind. You can require them to wear enclosed shoes, especially if you're thinking about health and safety risks, for example. If you're using needles, it's probably a good idea to have enclosed shoes from a OH&S perspective. So things like that you can also consider. So I talked a little bit about this before with profitably structuring shifts. So, using your room efficiently, making sure that you've really planned out how you're going to utilize the room best. Rebooking clients, it's obviously, some people think that rebooking is a little, what's the word for it? They think it might be too salesy, but the reality is that we know most people need ongoing treatment or would benefit from ongoing treatment, whether they have a chronic illness or injury or chronic pain, or whether they just work in an office and don't exercise and stretch enough, and so they need you to help them. So you really need to think about rebooking from the perspective of helping your clients, not trying to make a sale. The money will flow from the good work you do rather than thinking about the other way around, but it definitely makes good business sense. Talked about bonuses and commissions a little bit there. You really need to make sure that you can get new clients. So if you're thinking about hiring for the first time, if you don't have a wait list and or clients actively coming to you, and you aren't sure if you're going to, if you can't fill your own books yet, you need to really nail that. Now getting your own clients, now you're rebooking before you can get another therapist. Otherwise, you are going to be floundering trying to fill them, and it will cost you money if you're not careful. Now, when you think about a new therapist, if they are, if you've rostered them for a 3-hour shift and they only have one client, now if you're charging $110 a massage, minimum rate for a casual is about $35 an hour. 1 3-hour shift is going to cost you $105 an hour plus super, so around 115 roughly, a little bit more, say 120 to round up. It's going to cost you slightly more than one massage. So when you first start, you need to ask yourself what you're willing to lose and how you're willing to manage that shift. So, for example, you've got some new clients coming in, you've got one client booked in with this new therapist, or you've managed to convince one of your existing clients to swap to them, which I know for some people can be challenging because they like to see you, and you need to move to having a team and moving them to your new therapist. You may choose not to cancel that shift. You might think, I'm willing to cost me $10 for the shift because I want that person to start seeing clients. Now, you don't want to be doing that 2 months down the track and losing $10 on every shift, but you might be willing to do that on a couple of shifts to start with, especially when you can use that time for training. So whether that's hands-on back training with your therapist, whether that's teaching them how to use your booking system or other things around the clinic, that's a really good time to use it because you're paying them to be there anyway. Now, another thing we used to do if you're struggling to think of ideas for how you can transfer clients from yourself over to your new staff, particularly when you've got graduates, if they need a bit of a confidence boost, or if you want to show them some new techniques that you use specifically or ways that you do things. One thing that I've seen done really effectively, especially if you've got a long wait list, is to say to your clients on the wait list, hey, I can't see you for 3 weeks. You've got that appointment booked, but I've got a new therapist starting next week. I'm doing a session with them. They can see you. I'll be in the treatment with you. You'll get both of us working on you at the same time. Would you like to book that in? Now, often people, if they've been sitting on your wait list, will say yes. Now, it means that you've had a therapy. You still get them to pay like a normal session. And it means that you can do some training with the therapist. And hopefully you can convince that client to stay with the therapist instead of coming back to you, particularly if they're your existing client. So, okay, getting new clients. Yes, so if you haven't nailed getting your inflow of new bookings, you really need to think about your marketing and advertising. You also, if you haven't started thinking about this, need to think about starting to talk about we, if you were a solo practitioner hiring for the first time. So here at Insert Business Name, we do this. Start posting photos with your new therapist when you hire them. Don't just have everything about you. It's very easy to do when we start, and it's very effective because people like to come to see you. They don't come to see your business as much as we'd like to think that. But obviously, as you grow, they start to know that everyone at your business has the same reputation as you do. So that's great. One of the things that sits in this basket of getting people to do, getting therapists to do other work when they don't have clients so that you're making use of their time, is sometimes people will ask me, can you pay a therapist admin wages for the time when they're working on admin? The short answer is no, but I will explain a little bit more. So if you have a therapist who's working a 5-hour shift and in the middle of the day someone cancels, so they have an hour free, you get them to do some reception duties. No, they're employed as a therapist, you pay them as a therapist. Now, let's say you have someone who says to you, I can really only work 3 days a week as a massage therapist. I don't want to, or I can't handle more physical work than that. But you're also looking for some admin work. And they say, but I'd be happy to do 3 hours of admin work on Thursdays and Fridays, and I will massage Monday to Wednesday. Because they are two distinct roles, you can agree to pay them the lower admin rate for the 2 shifts that they work as an admin. So I just want to be clear that it's to pay 2 different pay rates. The roles need to be very distinct and different in the timing that they are done. You can't just have a therapist do an hour in between clients and try and treat that as admin. It has to be 2 different roles. So this doesn't happen often, though I do have some people who've done something like this before. So just be very careful if you want to go down that path, and have a chat with me if you have any questions. So just a few obligation and, the boring back end bits and pieces of having staff. So you do need to have payroll software in Australia. So in Australia, we have something called Single Touch Payroll, which was brought in by the ATO a couple of years ago. So basically what it is it means that every time that you pay someone, that is reported directly to the ATO via Single Touch Payroll integration. So if you've had a job in the last few years, you would have seen this, but if you work for yourself, you probably haven't noticed, unless you're paying yourself as an employee on your payroll. You can log into your MyGov account and you can see how much your employer has paid you, both wage, tax, and super in each pay period and as a total for the year. So to do that, you need what they call Single Touch Payroll compliant software, which basically every payroll software offered in Australia is. And normally this would just be attached to your accounting/bookkeeping software. So if you are still manually doing your books, be aware that you're going to need to get bookkeeping software. You're going to need to get a payroll module. And if you're going to do that, I would recommend that you talk to your accountant, who will probably recommend that you get bookkeeping software as well. And I say this too because as you grow and your books become more complex, particularly if you're not registered for GST now and you will be with the amount of money that you will bring in revenue after you have an employee working with you, then it's much easier to manage using bookkeeping software. So, and this is things like Xero, MyOb, QuickBooks, Reckon. There are a few of the big names. Xero is one of the most popular. I personally use Xero, and I did use that as well when I was helping run a clinic. So in my paperwork, if you go in and have a look, if you get a contract from me, you'll see in there I also have a bit of a guide on how to set up payroll in Xero for the first time. It's not hard, it just takes a few steps. If you're using a bookkeeper, they often have the capability of setting this up for you, but you can also do it yourself if you are savvy, or if you just want to see how it works. It's a sort of step-by-step, fairly simple guide. The payroll itself is very easy to run once you have one of these systems. You can set up and you say, this employee's pay rate is $35 an hour for ordinary time, $45 for weekends, whatever the rate is. And then you simply input that each week. So you say they work 10 hours during the week, 10 hours on the weekend. It will automatically calculate the money. It will then automatically say, okay, that's $500 based on the ATO website. That means that we have to deduct $50 tax. And because you have to pay super, you also have to pay $50 super. I'm rounding, so this is loose numbers, just to give you an idea. So the top of the page will say you need to pay this person $450, you need to pay the ATO $50, and you need to pay the employee's superannuation fund $50. Now, with the tax and the super, you only have an obligation to pay that at least quarterly. It's basically due at the same time as your BAS. The tax is due with your BAS. It's reported as part of your BAS. The super is separate, but basically payable at the same time. So if you don't already have this, I highly recommend that you get a holding account for your tax. If you haven't heard of the book called Profit First, it's a fantastic book. It's a bit like, if you've ever heard of Barefoot Investor, it's a bit like Barefoot for Businesses. Comes up with the idea that you have different sub-accounts and basically buckets of money. So, if you're bringing in $200,000 revenue a year because there's you and a couple of therapists, and you need to pay 10% GST on that, there's 20 grand. And let's say you need to pay, you've paid $100,000 in tax to your employees, so there's $10,000 super, and there's, let's estimate and say $20,000 taxed from the employee's wage that you need to pay. There's $50,000 a year that you need to make sure you've got set aside every quarter to pay the ATO. So highly recommend having a holding account that you regularly transfer money to. Now, if you want to pay the employees super every week or fortnight when you pay their wages, you can absolutely do that. The same with your BAS, you can pay installments to the ATO, voluntary. But you don't have to until the end of the quarter. So it's really up to you. It's often easier to do it quarterly because then you don't have to worry about extra payments each week, unless you don't like, some people don't like having lots of money sitting there. They prefer to send it out regularly so they don't get any surprises. But that's a good way to make sure you've got enough to cover the surprises so there aren't surprises. Another thing you need is workers' compensation insurance. So this essentially is for any worker if they injure themselves at work. So probably unlikely. It's a fairly low risk industry in allied health. But let's say, for example, they trip over something and they break their arm when they fall, and because they put it out and break their fall and fracture their wrist, for example. Now, there's medical bills associated with that, and there's also time off work. What happens is a workers' compensation insurance will pay the worker and cover the medical bills. Now, normally this is about 1.5% of wages, roughly, that you need to pay on top of their wage. And depending on which state you're in, depends on how the system works. So, for example, in WA, we have private insurers. So there's about 5 different insurance companies that you can run your insurance through. It's very regulated, so there's only a handful. It's not like house insurance where there's hundreds. Whereas I'm previously from Queensland. I'm, been in WA about 8 years ago. So hi to all the Queenslanders. I still identify as one. Very off tangent, but let's make this a little bit lighthearted. In Queensland, they have a state government run system. It's called, I think it's literally just called Workers Comp Queensland. Work Cover Queensland, sorry, is what it's called. You can only get insurance by applying to Work Cover Queensland. So each of the states has a different system. of either of those two options. So if you go to the website, I have a link inside my paperwork as well that will take you to the Safe Work Australia website. There's a link to each state in there. You can click on your state and it will tell you how to get your insurance. It's normally simple. You estimate wages you're going to pay for the year is the way it's done. So if you think I'm going to hire one therapist, they're probably going to work X amount of hours a week. They're probably going to pay them $40,000 roughly a year. You estimate that on your wage bill, on your insurance, and they will send you a bill for that, for a percentage of that wage based on the standard premium for the industry in that state, which, like I said, is normally about a 1.5% to, depending on your state. So that's how the workers' comp insurance works. And you do need to make sure you have that, because if you don't and someone is injured at work, you end up liable for that. So that's and it's also a legislative obligation. You will get in a lot of trouble for trying to avoid that. They will also ask you at the end of the year to confirm how much you actually did pay. If you paid less than you estimated, they will give you a credit. If you paid more than you estimated for wages, they will add additional onto your bill for next year. Right. So what next? Have you not hired, or maybe you're ready to hire? Maybe you have some more questions. So a few other things that I offer just to let you know where to from here. So like I said, there's a pay rate guide in my documentation that you can download. That will give you a bit of an overview of all the things we've talked about today. There's a couple of sheets that you can use to calculate your wage costs, your revenue examples, and the percentage of wages that percentage of revenue that wages will potentially cost you. I also offer a recruitment pack, which is just a simple group of documents. It's basically an example job ad, an example application form, some phone screen questions, a reference check form, an interview guide. Now, these are things you can make yourself, obviously, but if you you like to save yourself a bit of time, I've got them sort of pre-prepared and you can just use them and rebrand them for yourself. I also offer employment contracts. So if you're looking, whether you're ready right now or you're looking to hire, whenever you're ready to hire someone, basically I have a link through the website you can go and follow. You fill out the details of your business and your employee, and then I will draft you up a contract that's customized to your business. So I've got a lot of standardized things in there that I often get asked from clients in the industry. So it covers things like, can they poach your clients? What are the expectations around uniforms? What hourly rates apply? Just making it really simple for both you and the employee so that you don't have to refer back to the award constantly, but also to tick off on some of the things that you might have in a policy and procedure. So for example, if you work in a big company, maybe they have a, let's say you come from an industrial company working in construction, they might have a procedure about wearing appropriate personal protective equipment at work. Are you going to have a procedure that's about 3 lines that says that you expect them to wear black pants and a black top and enclosed shoes? No. So there's a lot of things in the contract that I've simply covered off on to save you having procedures, which is also a good question. Do you need procedures? Now, technically, there's no legal obligation for you to have procedures. You should have a safety policy because that helps to meet your obligations under workplace health and safety legislation. But you don't technically need anything in procedures. Should you have some, it's probably a great idea, but you're not going to have all the same procedures a big business would have. You might be more likely to have checklist style procedures that might be, how do you open the clinic? What are the things that you need to do? You need to unlock the door, turn on the computer, turn on the heaters, because it's winter when I'm filming this, turn on the aircon if it's summer, all those sorts of things. You might have a procedure that's a bit of a how-to manual on how to use your booking software. Where do they navigate to? How do they process health fund rebates? All those sorts of things. So what are some other examples of procedures? I also have some template procedures as well. If you want to get in touch, I can give you some examples. They're just ones that I had when I was helping to run a clinic. They just give you some ideas on how to, things that you might want, and they might give you a starting point that's a little bit useful. What are some other things that you might need to know? There's also things, so when you do make an offer of employment to someone and you give them a contract, you also need new starter paperwork. So legally, you need to give them a Fair Work information statement, and if they're casual, the casual supplement. You also obviously need to get their bank details, tax declaration, and superannuation details. So essentially, I just have all of this in a folder for you as well. So if you get a contract from me, that's all in there just to save you time. You don't need to create, you don't need to create your own documents. They're just all there for you to download. Also got some examples of, I talked a little bit earlier about the casual conversion and how you would swap someone over from being casual to part-time. There's some information in there about just an illustration of what that looks like, about if they're working, 15 clients now, you want them to work 20, and how you sort of frame that for them. So there's some really handy stuff there. Now, if you still have more questions, maybe from the masterclass, or maybe you've got a slightly alternative business, like one of the examples where I said maybe you're running a clinic and you also have a Pilates studio and you want a bit of advice on what to do with those employees, or perhaps you are just running a clinic and you've got a few questions about things that weren't covered today or that you're still not clear on, please just get in touch with me. You can send me an email. You can book in a time to speak with me via my website. I've got a booking link there. They're probably the key ways to get in touch with me. You can also follow me on Insta and send me a DM, but I'm probably more likely to respond to an email if it's a detailed question. If it's just a short question, I'm normally happy to respond free of charge. If it takes a little bit more time to discuss with you, I'll let you know how much time it's going to take, and we can either book a call or I can send you a written response. Likewise, if you're getting a contract from me, if you're not sure what to pay someone and you have a therapist in mind, happy to help with calculating their pay rates for you as part of the contract. That's part of the service I offer. Now, probably the only other thing to note is a little bit about, other things that I offer / what to do if things go wrong. So let's say that you get down the track, you've hired someone and they're not working out. And you have two, like you either are going to go down the performance management path, or perhaps they're in their probation and you don't want to continue their employment beyond the end of their probation period. I can certainly give you advice on how to deal with those situations. Whether that's practical advice on how to have those conversations, whether it's legal, advice relating to your legal ramifications and what you need to be aware of, I can do that. Or whether it's just, you need a termination letter so that you can issue to your employees. That's something else that I can help you with. Just on an ongoing basis, some of the things that I also help people with, every year I will send out an email to clients about the annual wage review. If you've had a contract from me, I'll send you a link to an example remuneration review letter so that you can do that yourself for your staff. I can certainly write them for you, but generally I just send out a template so that you can sort of do that yourself without having to engage someone else all the time. I try and keep people updated on what's happening in the world of HR. My goal is essentially so that you can be confident to hire without having to feel like you have to know everything, and just knowing where to go to ask for help. I will say that Fair Work actually has some pretty good resources on their website. They've done a lot of work in the last couple of years to make it easier for small businesses, because I think they've realised how complicated they had started to make it. So there are some good resources there if you want to have a look, or like I've said, just give me a buzz if you've ever got questions. Now, that's all for today. I'll just stop presenting. Great. It's been great to have you along. If you've got any feedback, please let me know. If you've got any other questions, let me know, and keep an eye out for, future bits of information I'll put out. If I think of anything that I haven't covered off on this, I'll add some additional videos. And like I said, I can also add in I'll add in the links that you'll have access to all the documents that I mentioned. And I look forward to hearing from you soon. Have a great day, guys.